Epithelial tissues cover and line body structures. They serve as protection. They help absorb substances across their membranes. They can help filter substances across their membranes. They can be used for excretion or movement of other items across their surface. They can be used for secretion. They can secrete substances. And they can also be involved in sensation. Epithelial tissues cover and line body structures. So what that means is that it covers the outside of your body, my very scientific drawing of a person, outside of the body, as well as any kind of tubes or structures you find inside of the body that carries fluids or air. So these will line not just your outside skin, your epidermis, but also your mucous membranes, such as the skin inside of your mouth, inside of your nose, inside of your vagina if you have one. And it also lines the inside of hollow or liquid-filled tubes inside of your body. So it lines the interior portion of the digestive tract. Urinary tract. Blood vessels, etc. When you think of an organ or a structure or a space, it's going to be lined by epithelium. Think for a moment then, when you consider these different types of organs and organ systems, think about some of the roles that lining might serve. Where might you find epithelium that has a protective function? Your skin, right? Your epidermis. Here you will find that there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of layers of cells between the outside world and the inside of your body. What this is going to, and the outside ones are very tough and rugged. And since they're so tough and rugged, and since you have so many layers of cells between the inside of you and the outside world, you can afford to shed a few whenever you scrape up against something. And the inside of you is still all nice and happy. In this way, your skin helps protect your insides from the outside world. Those outermost layers of skin, and we'll go into this more with the integumentary system, which is all about the skin, features additional characteristics that help protect you against the outside world. So that layering and toughness helps against scrapes and bumps and anytime you brush up against something. You're also protected because the keratin that is accumulating in your skin cells will help protect you against water. Water can't just percolate in from the environment. It beads up on the surface of your skin, right? So you have waterproofing aspect. You secrete sweat and oils that have an acidic pH that can help kill off pathogens and outcompete other pathogens. You have a microbiome that lives on your skin. This isn't really part of your skin or epithelium, but you have a microbiome that the secretions of your skin helps maintain, that helps crowd out pathogens. You have immune cells that can invade into the epidermis. The epidermis and your mucous membranes too are your barrier between the inside of you and the outside world. It's a protective type of tissue. Where do you absorb things? You absorb things in your urinary system, like in your kidneys. Right? Your kidneys have to filter stuff out, so really they belong in both places, right? The kidneys will absorb some things into the urine and then put things back into the bloodstream. Digestive system is the big one, though. Right? You consume foods. Some of those sugars are going to start being absorbed into your bloodstream straight away in your mouth. Once it gets into your stomach, you're going to churn it up with acid and mechanical movement. You'll absorb a little bit there. You'll pass it on into your duodenum. Your body's going to secrete a bunch of stuff into that churned up food to make it so it's not so acidic coming out of your stomach acid, and so that things can be broken down in a way that your intestines can handle. It'll go through your intestines, and your intestines, your small intestines, will absorb up all of the nutrients, the carbohydrates, the proteins, the fats that it possibly can from the food that you eat, and put it into your bloodstream. When it passes from your small intestine into your large intestine is going to remove water. It's going to absorb water and put that back into your bloodstream so that you can reclaim as much hydration as you can from the food you eat, which reduces the amount you have to drink, and also so that you have formed feces and you don't just have diarrhea all the time. We just mentioned the kidneys have not just an absorptive function, but also a filtrative function. Blood comes into the kidneys, goes through a bunch of little tubules that are lined with epithelium. And across that epithelial barrier, some things can move in or out of it depending on what the barrier is like in that place. But it's all epithelium. That whole barrier is epithelium. Excretion or movement. So movement in particular, this is a great picture of something that moves things. Think back to when we were talking about cells and think about how you might move something across a surface. Epithelium is found on surfaces, so we're talking about movement across surfaces. Right, on ciliated tissues, cilia. You find a lot of cilia in your respiratory system. Your respiratory system. You breathe in air. You also breathe in a bunch of stuff that's not air. You breathe in brake dust and pollen and dust, dander. You don't want all that going into your lungs. Whatever happens to make its way past your throat and in towards your lungs, you want to make sure it gets back out. So your passages all through your respiratory system are lined with epithelium that's richly ciliated. And that cilia will excrete mucus onto its surface, blah, 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 right here. That will catch all the particulate that you breathe in the air, or a lot of it anyway, blah, 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 getting caught in the mucus. And then the cilia will rhythmically beat that mucus along the passageway to get it either out of your lungs or out of your nose. It pushes that now gunk-filled mucus to the back of your throat where you can safely swallow it, and it gets processed by your digestive system. It's kind of interesting that way to think that you might actually be dealing with air pollution with your gut, doesn't it? Secretion, so you may secrete things like mucus, for example. You may secrete sweat, you may secrete oils. And sensation, the outside of your skin, that same barrier we were talking about before with in the context of protection, is also our main sensory, our main tactile sensory organ, in that it's filled with a lot of nerve endings that can detect heat, that can detect pressure, and your epithelium, the squeezing or heating up or cooling down, the manipulation of that tissue, is what will register into your nervous system as being that type of sensation. Certain arrangements of epithelium can form into pockets called glands. Glandular epithelium only secretes things, and like I said, it's arranged into pockets. Nearly everything that passes into or out of the body passes through the epithelium. And we just went over that, right? So anything that can go across your skin is epithelium. You can absorb some drugs directly in your mouth, like you can hold nitroglycerin underneath your tongue. That's for people with certain heart conditions. I don't even know if they prescribe that anymore, but you would hold that in like a little pocket under your tongue, and it gets absorbed through the mucosa of your mouth. You can absorb drugs vaginally or by a suppository across those epithelia. Your intestinal epithelium is what nutrients is absorbed across. You have movement of molecules past the barriers of the bloodstream at certain points. It's all happening across your epithelium. So we talked before at a cellular level about how just about everything that happens in the body happens across a membrane, right? You have some sort of a separation of out versus in, and there's a barrier, and things have to happen across that barrier. Well, interestingly, it happens across the barrier at a macro scale too. You have a special sort of a membrane-ish barrier of epithelium that might be one cell or it might be a zillion cells thick. And just about everything that you're doing is going to, the movement of anything is going to happen across that barrier as well. All epithelium has the following things: polarity, specialized contacts. It's all supported by a basal lamina, which is in turn supported by a reticular lamina. All epithelium is avascular and innervated, and it's all regenerative. We'll take this one at a time. Polarity refers to there being an apical surface and a basal surface. A basal is what you would think of as the bottom. It's what's found closest towards the basement membrane. The apical surface is what you're going to think of as the top. So whichever aspect is facing most superficially to that space, whether it's to the outside world or the inside of a blood vessel, is going to be the apical surface. If we're talking about an epithelium that's only one cell thick, then each cell will have a basal and an apical aspect that's very easily identified. If you have, let's see, this is where all the epithelium is sitting on. If you have, let me pretend these blocks are cells. I'm not going to draw on the nucleus because it's just going to be too time consuming. Where you have a bunch of layers between the inside and outside world. To determine whether you're looking at an apical surface or a basal surface, you're going to need to get context. You'll need to be able to zoom out a little bit to see where is the lumen. That's like the inside of a tube, the hollow or a fluid filled inside of a tube, lumen or space. And where is the basement? Only when you see those two things can you typically determine which side is the apical side and which is the basal aspect of any given epithelial cell. Epithelium is fitted together with primarily tight junctions. You're also fitting together with adherent junctions, which is like, so adherence junctions, I didn't mention this before, junctions, which are sort of like desmosomes. But less flexible. They're still somewhat flexible, but they're less flexible. They have a more locked together type of arrangement with the fibers that stick into the intracellular space, but they still are separated from one another slightly by those fibers. So they're fitted together by tight junctions and adherence junctions. Epithelium is supported by a couple of layers of connective tissue. The most superficial of the two layers is your basal lamina, which is a sticky glycoprotein collagen sort of a mesh that helps the epithelium resist stretching or tearing or shearing. It also provides a scaffolding along which wound healing can happen. That is stuck down below it, deep to it, by something called reticular lamina, which is really just like a boundary continuation of whatever connective tissue is under it. Epithelium almost always bounds or borders a type of connective tissue deep to it, not including the basal lamina or the reticular lamina. So you can think of, tissue type whatever. Right up over it, superficial to it, you'll have the reticular lamina, which is like a glue. Just above that, you'll have the basal lamina. Together, we're going to call this the basement membrane. The basal lamina is more sort of flexible. And then on top of the basal lamina, you have your epithelium. So the reticular lamina is going to keep the whole thing glued onto the tissues underneath it. The basal lamina has a little bit of give so that when you rub up against it this way, for example, you don't just tear the whole thing up in that direction. It can sort of shift and move a little bit with certain shearing forces. So we're combining rigidity with a little bit of flexibility to create something that's ultimately quite strong. Reticular lamina would glue down the epithelia quite nicely on its own, but anytime something touched it, it would tear. The basal lamina would provide a fair bit of flexibility, but it would have a hard time sticking to the underlying tissue. Remember this type of arrangement of rigidity plus flexibility equals overall strength. Remembering this concept is going to help you tremendously when we talk about the skin in the integumentary system, and especially when we talk about the bones. Epithelium is avascular. A refers to an absence of or none. Vascular refers to blood vessels. So avascular means no blood vessels. This is a little counterintuitive, isn't it? If you cut your epithelium on your skin, your epidermis, which is made of epithelium, you bleed, right? Well, if your epidermis doesn't have any blood, how is it that you bleed? Well, also they're living cells. If they don't have a blood supply, if they don't have blood vessels in them, how do they get the nutrients they need from your bloodstream? What you'll find is that connective tissue, let's do the CT, and then you have the combined basal and reticular laminas to make the basement membrane. And then you have, your epithelium. The connective tissue, I'll erase this, has lots of big blood vessels that move through it. And it'll give off quite a number of capillaries immediately deep to the epithelium. Not just in the basement membrane, but throughout the dermis. You'll find larger blood vessels as well as dense capillary beds immediately deep to the epithelium. From that capillary bed, nutrients, oxygen, and things can percolate up through the layers of epithelium. And conversely, the epithelium can dump off their wastes across the layers of cells through the epithelium back into the bloodstream. So the epithelium itself does not have blood vessels in it, but the capillary beds that it does feed off of lie immediately deep to those epithelium, to those epithelial cells. So they have no blood vessels, but they are innervated. Meaning they have nerves, or more specifically, nerve endings. At least nerve endings, if not nerves. They can detect changes within themselves and from the outside environment by these nerve endings. You have nerve endings throughout your outside skin, your epithelium, your epidermis, the skin that touches the outside world. And when you touch things, you feel it. That's because there's a lot of nerve endings that are embedded into that epithelium that pick up changes in the epithelium and register it to your brain. Finally, importantly, epithelium is regenerative. It grows back. If you cut your skin, it'll grow back. You might get a scar, but it's not going to stay an open wound forever. This is a really, really, really important and necessary feature of epithelium because since it lines everything in your body, it does two things. It protects underlying structures to some, maybe small degree, and it also controls the movement of things into and out of your other adjacent tissues. If you get rid of that barrier, then things can move freely. Your body and life in general relies on the separation of things and the movement of things across these separations to sustain itself. If you break down too many of those barriers, you don't live anymore. Now let's talk about different arrangements of epithelial tissues and where you find them and what they do. Again, for lecture purposes, for module regular purposes, we're going to focus on the purpose, the role, the function of these tissues. I will mention where they are and what they look like here in these slides, but we're going to focus more on their appearance in lab. So simple epithelium just means epithelium that's one cell thick. There's three main shapes of epithelium. Squamous, which is flat and squidgy and usually looks like that with a nucleus in the middle. cuboidal, which is about as wide as it is tall, and columnar, which is tall, like a column. Usually has an oval type of nucleus as well. Simple squamous epithelium then means flat, squidgy, pancake-like cells, one cell layer thick. You will find this type of cells anywhere where you need a rapid, easy transfer of molecules across a surface. So the alveoli of your lungs, those little pockets of your lungs where air, oxygen can get dumped into your capillaries very quickly and easily, and carbon dioxide comes out from your bloodstream and to be exhaled very easily. It's a very, very, very thin, easily passable membrane. Filtration membrane of the kidney is primarily simple squamous epithelium, so that molecules can move back and forth across it into and out of your bloodstream and into and out of your urine. Your capillaries are all epithelial, simple squamous epithelium as well. You need for things to be able to move between the bloodstream and your individual cells, nutrients, wastes, oxygen, carbon dioxide, things like that. So these, anytime you're talking about easy, rapid movement of something across a surface, you're probably going to find simple squamous epithelium. There's two special kinds of epithelium that I need you to know, simple squamous epithelium that I need you to know. Endothelium and mesothelium. Mesothelium lines the outside of organs and inside the body wall. Oftentimes on the outside of organs, this is also going to be known as serosa. Not always, but often. So the outside surface of all your organs just about is lined with mesothelium. You might have heard the term mesothelium from like commercials that you see on TV called mesothelioma, or about, from law firms about suing for mesothelioma reasons. What that's all about is that back when we used to put a lot of asbestos in our homes. This sounded like a great idea, and in a lot of ways, it really was a great idea. Asbestos is a fabulous material for insulating and fireproofing in particular. So you would find it like lining fireplaces and chimneys. It doesn't transmit heat very well in general, so you would find like asbestos foam kind of surrounding pipes in people's homes. And it's extremely effective. And if you leave it alone and don't do anything to it, it's harmless. But the problem is that when you chip away at it, maybe you're renovating, maybe you're replacing the insulation, maybe you're swapping out a furnace, maybe whatever. If you start chipping away at it, it turns into these extremely fine fibers. They're extremely, extremely fine, and they're extremely sharp. And when you inhale them, when they stick into your respiratory epithelium, it tends to cut. And they can cut through to the outside layer of your lungs, the serosa, the mesothelial lining of your lungs, where it just kind of sits and sticks. The accumulation of these asbestos fibers, coupled with the constant wounds that they create and the inflammation that's caused by having those wounds, whenever you have these constant inflammatory or wound healing kind of processes going on that you don't ordinarily have to do, it increases the likelihood that you're going to get cancer in that spot. So when people were absorbing a lot of asbestos because they were contractors helping to renovate homes and they were experiencing a lot of asbestos going up in the air, they would inhale this and they have a higher risk of mesothelioma, cancer of their thoracic cavity, specifically in that mesothelial lining around their lungs. Endothelium lines a lot of your liquid-filled tubes in the body. And especially it has this very slippery inside surface. So you're going to find endothelium lining your lymphatic vessels, the inside of your heart, which of course is filled with fluid, blood, and the inside of all of your blood vessels, including the entire capillary lining. So we said capillaries are simple squamous epithelium. They're one cell layer thick. The inside layer of those capillaries is a little extra slippery so that blood and liquid and stuff can slip past them without sticking. So strictly speaking, the lining of all blood vessels, including the entire boundary that makes up the capillary is endothelium. Simple cuboidal is, oh, and over here the epithelium you can see is they're flat and pancakey. So there's, whoops, one cell, another cell, another cell, another cell, another cell. And I'll erase these in just a moment so you can see. It's just, it almost looks like this dotted line that lines the middle of this hollow space. You can see there's a lot of stuff around here. This is clearly a thing. This is pretty homogeneous and looks overall boring. That's liquid. So it is a boundary between something that looks like something and some fluid filled inside, which means it's going to be some kind of epithelium. And you can hardly make it out. It's this tiny, super thin pancake layer, so it's going to be simple squamous. Simple cuboidal is cells that are one cell layer thick, and they're about as tall as they are wide. They're not necessarily square shaped, but they do have sort of cuboid dimensions. They're as tall as they are wide. You find these places where you're going to be doing secretion and absorption, primarily lining glands and kidney tubules. Simple columnar epithelium is also found places with secretion and absorption, but is covered by microvilli. Scratch this occasionally, cilia. That's not really we're worried about the microvilli part of this. You're going to find simple columnar epithelium in your digestive tract abundantly. Across your simple columnar epithelium, you're going to absorb nutrients from the foods that you eat, and you're also going to secrete mucus so that things can slip along past it nicely. Stratified epithelium is stacked. So you have lots of cells, well, at least 2 layers of cells between the basement membrane and the ultimate apical surface, between the basement membrane and the lumen of a tube, or between the basement membrane and the outside world, space, air. Squamous, if you recall, is those pancake-like cells. They're flat, they're squidgy edged, and they stack up like pancakes. Stratified means there's a zillion layers of it. Well, there's multiple layers of it. In the case of stratified squamous, you'd find that there's lots. So like, here's a layer, and here's a layer, and here's a layer, and here's a layer, on up. The bottom layers of stratified squamous epithelium look cuboidal-ish. But are still technically part of stratified squamous. And as they get closer to the surface, look flatter and flatter. These structures are thick and non-permeable to water-based substances. They're non-permeable to a lot of larger substances as well. For you to cross the barrier of your skin, you need to have at least some sort of a hydrophobic component, and yeah, you have to have some sort of hydrophobic component is the major thing you need. You find these at places where you experience mechanical stress. So think about your body and think about all the places where something is going to have to rub up against it. The outside of your skin, the inside of your mouth, your throat, your esophagus, part of your esophagus. Anyway, you have food that you have to swallow, and so that food is rubbing up along the inside. You also find it in the outermost portion of your anal canal, where pretty formed, firm feces have to pass through, and you're no longer doing any absorption or secretion there. You're just sort of passing it. And also as well in a woman's vagina, you find stratified squamous epithelium. You find this at sites of mechanical stress, frankly, because you can afford to lose a bunch of layers and you still haven't actually broken the skin. So this is a good barrier between the inside of your body and the outside of your body, with a lot of layers that you can afford to shed if you do have really firm friction. Stratified squamous epithelium may be keratinized or non-keratinized. Keratin is a waterproofing and toughening protein that accumulates in stratified squamous epithelium in places of your body that really face the outside world, faces like air for the most part, and is non-closable. So the outside of your skin is really what we're talking about. Your regular old interacting with the world, touching, feeling skin. Since it has this waterproofing aspect to it, it's able to retain its moisture internally a little bit, and so it doesn't need to be constantly bathing the outside of it in fluid. Non-keratinized epithelium are referred to as mucous membranes. Oops, I don't know why it's disappearing. Referred to as mucous membranes. They're stratified squamous epithelium, and you do have to secrete liquid onto their surface to keep them healthy. So the outside of your skin, like the outside of your cheeks, is stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. You have to put lotion on it and stuff sometimes, but really it's healthy regardless. The inside of your mouth is also stratified squamous epithelium, but there it's non-keratinized, and you notice it's always wet, right? So the inside of your nose, same thing. The vagina, same thing. These places have to be kept moist to keep that epithelium in good condition, and it's because they don't have keratin to keep moisture inside. Stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar are rare. If you're ever looking at a slide or thinking about a test question and you're trying to rule things out, I wouldn't even consider stratified cuboidal or stratified columnar unless I had a good reason to keep it in the running. They're both rare. Stratified cuboidal epithelium you find in the ducts of like large puberty-related glands. So for example, like the glands of your armpits that are off when you're a kid and then they turn on and get stinky when you're an adult or when you hit puberty. And it's not typically, but always just 2 layers thick. Stratified columnar also maxes out at 2 layers. And really the only place you find it meaningfully is tiny amounts in your throat, overwhelmingly in the male urethra. That's really where, if you ever see a test question, read a book, whenever you hear about stratified columnar, they're going to mention the male urethra, not the female urethra, just the male urethra, stratified columnar. There's 2 special kinds of epithelium that doesn't really neatly fit into the simpler stratified category. The first kind is pseudostratified columnar epithelium, where it looks stratified, but it is not actually stratified. Now, if you think back to that stratified columnar epithelium, or even cuboidal epithelium, you have your cells. Nucleus, 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 and then another layer of cells. Nucleus, 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 nucleus. All these nuclei line up nice and neat. That's because they are truly evenly stacked on top of one another. A good way to pick out pseudostratified columnar epithelium is that you have like all these layers of nuclei. They're all over the place. They kind of sort of make up rows, but then you have like this extra one that worms its way in, and this one seems to dive down, and this one goes up and over. It looks like it has more than 2 layers, first of all, which should be a dead giveaway that it can't be cuboidal or columnar, because those max out at 2 layers if they're stratified. So it can't be either of those. Therefore, the only other option for something that looks tall and skinny and looks like it has a bunch of layers is pseudostratified columnar. What's happening here is that you have your basement membrane, and then some of them are short and squat, and some of them are long and skinny. You have other ones in between, and then you have this guy over here. They're all these different arrangements. They all attach to the basement membrane, but they're shaped pretty unevenly. The ones at the surface are heavily ciliated. This is the tissue that you find lining your respiratory tract, your upper respiratory tract, and some of your lower respiratory tract as well. You're going to secrete mucus to the outside of the respiratory epithelium. The cilia is going to beat it in that direction that we talked about before. Finally, transitional epithelium is only really found in the bladder, the urethra, and the uterus. This is designed to stretch significantly. So what you find here is a basement membrane is that it has this big bubbly kind of appearance to it, nucleus, 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 and it kind of goes all over the place. It has this, and you can see these cells all have these big rounded edges to them. This way, when you have a stretch out to either side, like when your bladder gets full, like while you're urinating to allow your urine to pass, like while your uterus is stretching out to accommodate a baby, these cells can get stretched into sideways cells, basically horizontally aligned cells, without tearing apart. They're made to be a little extra flexible and a little bubbly to allow for a little extra stretch. Your body membranes are made up of epithelium bound to connective tissue. We've already talked about this. All epithelium is bound to connective tissue. Your cutaneous membrane, you have cutaneous membrane, mucous membranes, and serous membranes. We've touched on all of this already. Your cutaneous membranes are your outside skin. So cutaneous, the CUT refers to keratin. The epithelial layer of your skin is called the epidermis, which is made up of what kind of epithelium? Like what type of epithelium did we say? Stratified, squamous, keratinized epithelium. For a correct answer on an exam, you have to give all of that. Never give less information than you think you should have to. So the epithelial layer is called epidermis. The epithelial layer is made of stratified, squamous, keratinized epithelium. The connective tissue layer, because remember, epithelium always sits on connective tissue. You have your basement membrane that's going to attach it to underlying stuff, and that's called your dermis. Your mucous membranes are inside the body but open to the exterior. So we already talked about that, like the inside of your mouth, for example. This is a mostly stratified squamous, a little bit of columnar epithelium that's in the distal end of your digestive tract, close to, but not right at that stratified squamous part of your anal canal. These lie directly onto areolar lamina propria, which is under the basement membrane, its own special little connective tissue layer that keeps it anchored onto something that's not connective tissue. So mucous membranes are going to go from epithelium to something else, like a muscular layer, pretty quick without very much connective tissue in between. Your cutaneous membrane has a big, fat connective tissue layer immediately underneath it. And these membranes are bathed by mucus, the inside of your nose, the inside of your mouth, or by through the length of your digestive tract, those cells will secrete. You have goblet cells, they're called, that secrete mucus along their length, or urine. Your urinary system is also lined with some mucous membranes, and in that case, they don't secrete mucus, they secrete urine, or they are bathed by urine, so they don't need mucus. Serous membranes is a simple squamous epithelium line on a thin areolar membrane. So you've got your basement membrane, you've got your lamina propria, your areolar lamina propria right under it. And these are in places that are inside the body and closed to the exterior. So we talked about these membranes already, and we said that they are properly, collectively called the tissue would be mesothelium. So your pleura, for example, your pericardium is made up of mesothelium and is a serous membrane. Your peritoneum is made up of peritoneal mesothelium, and is your digestive system's serous membrane. All of them have visceral and parietal sides. Remember we talked about visceral pleura and parietal pleura? This is what we're talking about. So it's this long double folding membrane that either touches the organ or it touches the body wall. And depending on where we're talking about, it might be the visceral aspect or the parietal aspect. Remember too, those membranes are one long continuous membrane. So it's not like you have serosa on the outside of your intestines that is confined to your intestines. That same membrane is going to undulate around the outside of all of your small intestines and your large intestines and your inside of your abdominal body wall and on the bottom side of your liver and around your stomach. That's all one long continuous membrane. And depending on where we're talking about, we'll have a little bit of a different name for it. The visceral and parietal aspects are separated by serous fluid. We already talked about that as well in the very beginning. You remember the example with the pleura? So there's a crudely drawn lung. You have the visceral pleura, and then the parietal pleura, visceral pleura, and in here is filled with really truly a tiny, tiny super thin amount, but we always draw it bigger to exaggerate so you could see it, of serous fluid. And that allows your organs to basically stick together and stick around to the body wall without you having any kind of shearing or tearing when things have to move. We had already mentioned here before earlier that your glands are lined by epithelium as well. And you have a couple of different kinds of glands. You have endocrine and exocrine. Endocrine glands, endo, inside, secrete directly into the bloodstream. So into the body, or more specifically into the bloodstream. Okay? Because they're right up against the bloodstream, you can see here these cells are lined, basically, or bound up by blood vessels, by capillaries specifically. So they don't need ducts. They can just make their stuff and secrete it, whoop, right into the bloodstream. You don't need any extra pathway. Structurally, these are very, very, very diverse. You can't categorize their exact arrangement in any kind of blanket terms. We talk about this organ by organ. Your exocrine glands secrete outside of the body. They have ducts because they're not directly up against where they need to secrete things to. Single-celled glands, mucus-making glands, are called goblet cells. And those are scattered among columnar epithelium. I'm going to abbreviate it here. You have to spell it out for a test. Both pseudostratified and simple columnar epithelium have goblet cells. These secrete mucus. These do require a little bit of a duct, as I said, because they secrete to something a little bit distant from where that's actually being made. An example of endocrine glands are things like your pituitary gland, your thyroid gland, your pancreas. These are all secreting things that go straight into your bloodstream. Your pancreas makes insulin and dumps it straight into your bloodstream. There's no extra ductwork needed. Your pituitary gland secretes things directly into the bloodstream. There's no extra ductwork needed. All of these are embedded throughout tissues and need a little duct to go somewhere. It's oftentimes fairly small if it's a single-celled thing. Like you can see a little outlet there. It's not much. Multicellular glands are much more complicated. They have a duct, but you have a lot more cells and a bigger, more robust overall shape. You'll see in lab that mucus gland, or that goblet cells, look like hollow little eggs nested among a bunch of other epithelium that takes up dye, but the goblet cells really don't because they're just filled with mucus for the most part. Multicellular glands, we'll see on the next slide, they can be simple or compound, they can be tubular in shape or alveolar in shape. So here you can see, and this is cut off a little bit, I'm sorry. You don't need to memorize all of these anyway, just sort of appreciate that they come in a variety of shapes. So alveolar are these sort of bunchy, round, grape-like arrangements. Alveolar refers to a grape-like cluster. Branching, tubular. It just looks like tubes that all come out from a duct. Here's your duct. A simple tubular gland would just come in like this. Simple alveolar would just look like that. And then you have compound, where each of those branches has more branches. A good example of and there's tuboalveolar, which is a combination of tubular and alveolar. So this is a good example of a sweat gland, tuboalveolar, where it comes in and then it kind of goes all over the place and branches a little bit. An oil gland next to your hair follicle is really just one simple tubular gland. There's a few different kinds of exocrine glands. I'm not super concerned about the shapes of the glands. You'll get into those as you need them. But the types of exocrine glands are important. These are all going to refer to how the cells of the glands, and these are all referring to compound multicellular glands, how these exocrine glands secrete their contents. So with goblet cells, you're really only secreting mucus. That's the only thing you have to care about. They make all these little secretory vesicles in the cell, and they just excrete them to the surface. For compound exocrine glands, you have each cell making something, and it's usually a little bit more involved than just mucus. Maybe it is oil, maybe it's sweat, maybe it's some sort of like earwax, for example. So there's three main different types of ways that you can release your contents. Your apocrine style of exocrine gland involves a pinching off of itself. I'll get into why this is controversial after I go through all three of these. It's debatable as to whether or not humans actually have apocrine. I include it because textbooks all say you have apocrine for the most part, and things like T's tests and whatnot tend to still include apocrine in this lineup. So it's worth knowing. But basically what that'll do is you have a cell that'll make something, pull it up towards the surface, and then pinch off that whole section and secrete like this budded off section of itself filled with the substance it's excreting. Merocrine glands secrete by plain old, regular old exocytosis, just like you learned about before, where it makes its product, the vesicle goes up to the surface, the vesicle membrane merges with the plasma membrane of the outside of the cell, and then when it merges, that bubble basically opens to the outside environment and the substance is secreted that way. Holocrine glands are where the cells rupture and cell fragments are released. Whether or not we have apocrine glands that pinch off like this versus a mix versus just holocrine glands is where the controversy comes from. There's a lot more evidence that suggests things that we used to consider apocrine are really just old observations of what turns out to really be holocrine activity. But anyway, holocrine activity is where cells rupture and the cell fragments are released. So you're basically making lots and lots and lots of something in here. The cell bursts and then spews bits of itself and its contents out into the area. You make sweat this way. You secrete ions and stuff like that into your sweat, and they get secreted nice and fairly tidy into here. Your oil glands are more like this, holocrine. So they fill with their substance and they explode. Now, think about acne for a minute. What do you get acne in? What glands are associated with acne? Oil glands, right? What is acne? What else do you need to make a pimple? You need bacteria, right? So you need bacteria to grow, and you need oil. And for bacteria to grow, you also need like food for that bacteria, right? If it doesn't have any food, it's going to die. So when you have an oil duct that secretes like this, you're going to have all the stuff, all that oil secreted into this duct, into this gland, plus all the contents of the cell, little bits of plasma membrane, whatever sort of nutrients and wastes were in the cell at the time. You have bits of nucleic acids, you have proteins that are all being extruded into here. And guess what? That's awesome, awesome bacteria food. So oil glands on your skin are closely associated with acne because they come with that extra food. Another characteristic we talked about before is that epithelial tissue has to be able to repair itself. The process goes basically like this. The tissue's wounded. Oh no, I have a terrible cut in my skin. Inflammation sets in and a clot forms. So you have this cut in your skin, and as a response, your body dilates blood vessels adjacent to it. And when these blood vessels, these capillaries, become bigger and wider, the epithelium basically spreads apart a little bit and gets a lot leakier. This is going to flood the area with blood and liquid. And that's basically what inflammation ends up being. In that area, you have, since you have extra blood going to this area, you're also going to have the platelets from the blood going into the area. When those platelets stick on to the surface of the wound, they send out a signal to attract even more platelets. And then those all send out signals to get even more platelets to stick on, more and more and more and more and more, faster and faster and faster, until the whole wound is closed up with a clot. What kind of feedback loop is that? Positive feedback, right? Remember, negative feedback is like an opposite, an offsetting of whatever's happening, so that you deviate from normal a little bit and you whip right back to normal. Deviate away a little bit from normal, whip back up to normal. Positive feedback involves this runaway chain reaction of events where something happens more and more and more and more and more and more and more until whatever's happening stops, full stops. Your platelets gather and gather and gather and gather faster and faster and faster until there's no more bleeding. Your uterus contracts and contracts and contracts and contracts and contracts. That was hard to say. Until the baby's gone, right? You just amplify, amplify, amplify until something is done. Positive feedback. Within that network of clots, you're going to have cells called fibroblasts that are going to come by. Now look, in the meantime too, your body's making new blood vessels to the area. Isn't that cool? It starts that really fast. In those blood vessels, you can send fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are special cells that secrete fibers. And these fibroblasts are going to come in and they're going to start to dissolve away the clot and lay down collagen fibers. Collagen is a major scaffolding protein in your body. After that, fibroblasts will leave once you have this nice fiber scaffolding created. And then epithelial cells, which are in the neighborhood anyway, when they divide, they can start to invade this space filled with fibers, and they'll lay themselves down along those fibers until it's filled in. Now, when you're making your skin in the first place, like when you're a baby, your collagen fibers and your cells are more or less arranged in layers. What direction those layers go in are called Langer's lines. We'll talk about that with the integumentary system. But they're laid down nice and neat. This is an orderly, pre-prescribed kind of a process. When you have a wound, your body has to go into, oh crap, repair, repair, repair mode, and does not lay things down so nice and neat. So instead of laying down all your fibers nice and even and stacked, it's just kind of got a, oh my God, I gotta fill it in, and it's pretty disorganized. Down here, your epithelial cells are all nice and lined up as they grow along those fibers. And in here, they're going to end up going all kinds of directions with whatever the direction the fibers are going into. This sudden spot of increased disorganization of fibers and cells is what makes the appearance of a scar. That's why a scar looks different. That's also partly why many scars, particularly pretty shallow ones or ones that aren't very major in the first place, will disappear over time, because this can all sort of get worked out. If they're big enough or thick enough relative to the underlying tissue, they may be fairly permanent because this can never really be restored back to normal. But if it's shallow, it can disappear with time. All scars diminish in appearance with time. Other tissues regenerate too, but how regenerative they are can vary. So epithelium regenerates, it wound heals, it heals up, repairs itself beautifully, quickly, easily, with minimal disruption to the rest of the body. Connective tissues, specifically areolar, which is a loose connective tissue, and dense irregular connective tissue, which you're going to find out is all over the place in your body, also regenerate really nicely. Those have blood vessels, so it's going to be able to get immune cells and platelets and stuff there, no sweat. Those will regenerate well. Bone can regenerate fairly well, provided that it's kept in its nice internal sterile environment and there's no extra complications and you treat it well while it's healing. It's a major structural thing, and it has the same sort of steps where it has inflammation and then it makes like a scab kind of, and then you have infiltrate into the scab and then you rebuild bone. And you have to be really careful about how you put weight and stress back on that bone as it heals so that you don't overdo it or underdo it, so it heals into the right shape and strength. With epithelium, it'll take care of itself. You don't have to worry about any of that except for maybe tearing the wound back open. With bone, it will heal well, but you need to take pains to take care of it. Blood also regenerates quite nicely. If you've ever donated blood, you know that you're not just permanently down a pint of blood, you'll make more blood. Smooth muscle, which is the muscle that lines your blood vessels, your urinary system, your digestive system, all that involuntary muscle in your body, heals, but not great. It takes a while to heal, and the functionality never returns 100%. Same goes for dense connective tissues like your tendons. Skeletal muscle and cartilage effectively don't regenerate. Your skeletal muscle, if you separate it wholesale from underlying tissue, you can replace it back into place. But if you just cut a muscle clean in half, you can stitch it back up, you can put it back together, but where that muscle is stitched up after the fact is never going to really work right again. Cartilage also doesn't heal, which many of you probably have heard your parents and grandparents complaining about their aching knees and their arthritis and whatever. That's all from a diminishment of cartilage. Cartilage, as you'll find, has very poor access to the bloodstream. And so when it dies, when little bits of it go away, there's not a whole lot feeding it to help it regrow. So epithelium, bone, some loose-ish connective tissues, or some connective tissues and blood all regenerate beautifully with minimal intervention. Smooth muscle and dense connective tissue, think tendons and ligaments, heal but not great. You can think of skeletal muscle and cartilage as basically not regenerating at all. Maybe it'll heal a little, just so it's not like flopping around and loose after the fact if you stitch it together, but that's kind of it. Cardiac muscle and nervous tissue do scar up, so they physically heal themselves back together. But that healed spot is never regenerative again. So you can put a nerve back in place and it'll scar together so that it's no longer separate, but it's not going to ever function properly again. It can doing so can help facilitate wound healing and help you develop like collateral nerves to form. Cardiac muscle, it'll heal back up and form a scar wherever there was injury, but that little scarred spot is not going to beat with the rest of the heart. So your heart is permanently weakened. Places where you've outright sever nerves, you might have function and stuff back again in that place, but it's not, that individual nerve is never really going to work the way it used to.